All right, class, so we are back to cover or resume our discussion on Cron's essay, Is Cryonics an Ethical Means of Life Extension? And we're looking at her subchapter, Utility, Wagers, and Gambles, 7th subchapter, and we're focused then on Pascal's wager. And so Cron opens with a quote from the French experimental biologist Jean Rostand, who was one of the first people to propose the idea of cryonics in general, or cryogenics. And in his preface to his 1962 self-published book, the cryonics movement, the prospect of immortality. And there again, we have this problem that even the father of cryonics is proposing that cryonics has to do with immortality, when, as we reasonably consider, at least just the revival is something we could hope for. I'm not really sure on the possibility of immortality, but we'll have to just leave that discussion for another day. And Cron points out that Rostand is quoted as writing, quote, "We have nothing to lose and possibly everything to gain by pressing research into cryonic suspension or cryonic preservation. And it is, in this sense, a Pascal's wager based on faith in science to be cryonically preserved," okay, unquote. And so this is basically the proposal that by putting our faith in cryonics, we all really have nothing to lose. After all, the possibility of a future life after we die now is better than the possibility of simply dying the first time around. In other words, if we cremate our body or bury our body, we're giving up on that hope, is the idea. And so if we become cryonically preserved, we're increasing the possibilities, and that's a better scenario, according to people like Rostand and Tandy. And so Rostand is suggesting that this type of gamble is related to Pascal's wager. So what is Pascal's wager? So generally this is with reference to cryonics, obviously, but yet we're thinking of the wager that was developed by the 17th century French mathematician and rationalist Blaise Pascal, who was born in 1623, passes away in 1662. And so this is a way to demonstrate for him that the benefits of believing in God outweigh the odds of not believing in God. And so for Pascal, we really cannot say for certain that God exists. Yet if we were to wager one way or another, the potential benefits outweigh the potential harm. And so I have here a diagram that I'm going to post on our D2L site with the two diagrams. So obviously the top diagram is a way in which we're understanding Pascal's wager. And then this bottom diagram is Cron's overlapping of Pascal's wager in relation to cryonic suspension, taking faith in cryonic suspension. So she's wondering, what do we do if we overlap Pascal's wager with cryonics by way of Rostand's suggestion? So if we look at the diagram, we're thinking with Blaise Pascal's notion that we need to place our bet on the idea that God exists. So if you wager for God and he exists, there's infinite happiness, etc., and goodness that's brought about because then you're going to heaven, provided that you're doing all the right things to get there too, right? But then it's better to take faith because then you have that possibility of going to heaven. And then two, if you wager against God and he exists, there's infinite loss, right? Because then you are going to hell. You are facing eternal damnation. And then if you have wagered that a belief in God, and if God does not exist, you have the finite loss of having worshipped God for a finite amount of time while you were alive, but then you have a finite loss, because then you're just disappointed, then you die, there was no God, no problem. So then if God does not exist and you have wagered a disbelief in God, then you have a finite gain. In other words, a life of indulgence without God. So for Pascal, the benefit seemed to be if you believe in God. It's a rationalization of a belief in God, essentially. So if we apply for Cron, Pascal's wager to cryonics, to the so-called cryonics payoff matrix, which is what she calls her diagram, it really looks as if we have everything to gain and very little to lose. So essentially, given Pascal's wager, the possibility of immense gain far outweigh the possible loss, which is also to simply die, rather than opening up the possibility for a future life that will be cut short if you simply do not opt for cryonic suspension, which initially with her cryonic payoff matrix, her diagram, it seems that the bet to go for cryonics is better. In other words, we have nothing to lose and everything to gain as a result of the gamble. Yet, as Cron points out, there are ethical objections that should be seriously taken into consideration, as specified earlier. So, in other words, from a utilitarian standpoint, there are better ways to spend your money, either on your family or charity or some other means to benefit people that are living. And then also too, there's the problem regarding changes in social and personal identity, which may lead to issues of a quality of life that is not worth living once reanimated. In other words, alienation from friends and family. And we could even think that upon reanimation, the quality of life is also questionable as far as how it is that what kind of health you're actually going to be in. That's another open possibility there too. And then 3, there is no guarantee of getting your body back from Alcor once you've been revived, because there's a possibility that Alcor might shift in terms of their ethics and not give you your body because they see you as a medical anomaly to be experimented on, etc., depending on the uniqueness of your situation. Then there's the possibility of devaluing the value of the relationships with friends and family that you have now as well. And so the cryonic enthusiast tacitly suggests that the life that they have now is only temporary and not as valuable as the life in a potential future without those friends and family. And so as a result, perhaps these pragmatic arguments of Cron are ways that she's suggesting that it's probably better to just simply die and avoid the technical difficulties of cryonic suspension as we just looked at. So thank you. We'll talk more about this later, and see you soon.